So, as Michael, or Stephen said, sorry, we did have a team of people that were responsible for helping us get this together. You can see those here on my screen. Hope that everybody can see my screen. Good. All right. And so a very widespread group of individuals. But if you have questions about the why and things like that, I would really encourage you to look at some of these individuals down here that came from the various entities that provided a lot of the insight as to how and why we made some of these changes. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and jump into what changes we did make and what that would look like. And so to do that, I want to start with a scenario here. I know all of you can read this, but I'll just go through it real quick just so that we can have a foundation for which we're going to work from. So before discharge, Mr. Jensen in 3103 asked to speak with the nurse manager, Ms. Jensen, the patient's wife. Said she really didn't want to complain, but felt like she needed to formally share her concerns about this particular hospital visit. It all started in the ED when Nurse Jackie was about to insert the IV, but got interrupted with a call on the Vocera. Jackie briefly placed the IV on a dirty tray table next to the bed and then proceeded to use it after the call. After that, Mr. Jensen was told that he was going to be admitted and that they had a room ready, and that there would be a room ready in about an hour. And 4 hours later, Mr. Jensen was finally admitted. During that time, no one communicated the delay or even offered him something to eat or drink. The next day, the hospitalist, Dr. Warren, told the patient he'd probably be in the hospital for 3 or 4 days while they ran some additional tests. However, the next morning, the cardiologist, Dr. Johnson, came in and said everything looks good and that the patient would be going home today. Dr. Johnson didn't examine the patient or ask any additional questions. After leaving the room, the hospitalist came by and proceeded with the discharge based on the cardiologist's notes. Mr. and Mrs. Jensen were both confused and frustrated with the lack of communication. And as you can see, there's some things I've highlighted and underlined. And what I want to first point out is that we're going to be moving back to classifying our event at the event level rather than the issue level. So there was a time frame for those of you that have been doing this for a while prior to November of 2017 where we did it similar to this, but again, it'll be a little bit different. Let me bring up, so with this, trying to find my screen, here we go, okay. I have already entered the majority of this event so that we can take a look at it. But the first thing I want to show you is what the submitters will see when they log in. The only thing they will be completing now is the person affected section, the feedback details, in which case they will provide one narrative, the one that we just saw. So they would, what I just read to you guys would basically be typed in the description of what happened here. And then any action steps that were taken, that's a new field. So if you or someone else, a nurse manager, did heart or any kind of service recovery, you would put those notes there. If this is from, a survey and it's a note that you received, you wouldn't have any action items. You just simply entered it into RL. And then the last section down here is the attachments, and that's if you receive a letter in the mail from a patient or anything of that nature, you would include it there. Now, the first thing I would point out is that you notice that there's not a classification here, not for the submitter anyway. And so they don't have to decide whether it's a complaint, a grievance, a compliment, or a suggestion for improvement, or anything of that nature. They just put in the details. And then the other thing you'll notice that it doesn't have the issue section or anything like that either, so they don't have the option to break that out. We're putting all of that back into the management form, in which case you, as the complaint and grievance coordinators, will now be taking that and entering that information. So with that, let's take a quick look back at our example. We're looking here. We know just by looking at this that we've got the 3 issues, which are highlighted in different colors here. And then I would point out what I underlined here is that she express this desire to formally share her concerns. So this would be a formal complaint in the sense that she's saying, I want to express this formally, which would then make it a grievance. And as we already pointed out, when you go into RL, I'm logged in now as a manager, and I've entered this event, but I will walk you through the steps that I did so that you can see it step by step. The first thing that I want to show you down here in the resolution and outcome section is where you're going to have the event classification, and as we pointed out, that's going to default to grievance. Okay? Now, someone may come in here and look at this and say, well, you know, I handled most of this at the time. I talked with the individual. I think this is a complaint, and I really want you to pay attention to this part because this is new, and this is what the group came together and put together based on an algorithm. I believe most of you have seen the algorithm, the decision tree that we use. If you're not familiar with this, we'll make sure you have a copy of that too, but the algorithm is now built in. So if you take this and you think it's a complaint and you change it to a complaint, it's going to begin asking you a series of questions. Is this a billing issue? We would say no. Was it received by letter or fax? No, we didn't get it that way. Okay, does it involve allegations of abuse or neglect or failure to comply with Medicare conditions of participation? Was it a formal grievance? Did it request written response? In this case, there are elements of that, but just to continue showing the algorithm, I'm going to go ahead and say no. Normally we would say yes there. Okay, and then it says, has the patient been discharged? And we would say no. And then was the complaint resolved by the staff present? If I say yes, it's going to come up and say, this meets the definition of a complaint. Please move to the next step, in which you would come down here. Now, because we know that this was, in fact, a grievance, I'm going to go ahead and change this to yes, in which case it's going to say this event meets the definition of a grievance. Go back to the event classification and change it to a grievance. So you need to come back up here and change this to a grievance. We're trying to automate this process, and hopefully we'll get this down so that if it turns out to be a grievance, this will automatically change. But at the moment, you're going to have to manually go back and change this to a grievance. So another thing that came out of this process is that anytime there's a grievance, we want risk management to be alerted to that. Now, it defaults to grievance automatically every time something is submitted, so we don't want every submission to fire off an alert to risk management. So after you go through that process, or you open this up and you know this is a grievance and it's confirmed that it's a grievance, that's where you would come here and check, yes, this is a grievance, it's confirmed. That's what triggers the alert to risk management. And that, when the risk manager gets that, then they would come back in. This part right here says, is this a patient safety issue? And it says risk manager to complete. So you as the complaint and grievance coordinator don't necessarily have to do anything with this because it's for the risk manager to complete. Now, many of you do both roles, so you'll just keep going right through this. But for those of you that have just a patient advocate type role, you would leave that for that person to complete. So this is the most significant change that you'll see so far. So now, when we look at our narrative here, we know that we have our several issues. And so I went in and I added each of these issues. We'll just go in and look at one. And keep in mind, we have the big narrative at the event level. Now we're looking at the issue level. The first thing that you'll see here is an issue classification. This is more of a subclassification. You'll notice that your only three options are the complaint/grievance, a compliment for a patient, or suggestion for improvement. So basically what we're trying to do is say, was this some sort of negative event that needs to be handled like a complaint or a grievance? Was this a compliment, or is this just a suggestion for improvement? So it's more of a generic classification, and it's not the classification that you were used to using. All of that, again, is done at the event level. Now, breaking this up into three different issues, I want you to think ahead a little bit, and at some point, knowing that this is a grievance, you're going to have to write a final letter. And in that letter, you're going to have multiple things that you need to address. So here's an example of a letter. In fact, this is the template or the guidelines of what you are now required to use. This, along with the interim letter and the acknowledgement letter that you have access to. It's also been loaded into RL, and I'll show you that in a minute when I get to it. But you'll notice here that the level of detail that we have to respond with is, this is your first concern, this is what we did, this is how we did it. This is your second concern, this is what we did, this is how we did it. So when you look at your big narrative that comes in at the event level, you need to break that up into your issues. So this is the first issue, and notice that I just put IV was placed on a dirty tray and then used on the patient. This does not have to be detailed here. We already have that in the narrative. This, just think of it as a subject line, just enough to know what we're talking about here. This is issue number one. We go down here to what is this feedback about? Let's get it clicked. Modify, you would click add, and what this is about. So it's about a person in this case. It was the person who sat it down on the dirty tray. I will point out, some of you have asked, and we were able to create this. We have an employee now that's just RN, or an employee for all others. I think some of you have asked for that for magnet purposes, so you do have that now. And so in this case, it was an RN. And you also have an option here to look up the employee by name. So you could click here and type in the patient's last name. I'm using a test environment, so right at the moment that wouldn't work for us, but it should be working on your end when we move it over into production. So that should make it a little bit easier to keep some of those names consistent. It should also include physicians that are actually within our system. So if there's some that are not, then they may not show on that list. But for the most part, anyone with a Texas Health email address should be included in that lookup. Not trying to pick on Arlington Memorial, but that's just where I happen to use this example from. And so the location levels would be, this is specific to the emergency room. And if you'll remember back at the event level, I classified this based on what took place on the third floor as opposed to what took place in the ER. So that submitting location or event level at the event level is, you can think of that as where the event was being submitted from, so that it gives you all, the complaint and grievance coordinators, some idea of where to start with this event. So once that's complete, then you would, in this case, it was not resolved and needs resolution. And that was the case with all three of them, with all three issues. So there's where we have the different issues. Once you have put in each of the issues, the next step, okay, well, let me back up one step. So prior to putting these issues in, another important thing for you to know is that none of the alerts have gone out to the managers when someone submits an event. So in the past, when you put that location level in, it would automatically send out that alert. The alerts now are going to be based on the issue level, or the issues that we've entered here. So until you as a complaint and grievance come in and add these issues and add the locations where they occurred, those alerts are not going to get sent out. So it's important that you saying my screen is not sharing anymore. Is it still sharing? Can you? Okay.
You're good.
I got a little pop-up here that says it's not sharing. Okay, I'll keep going. So, again, just make sure that you get these issues entered in as soon as possible so that the managers can begin their review process. And with that, I'm going to switch to that review process and the steps that you would take. So, being that this is a grievance, we all know that the first thing that you need to do now is to get the acknowledgement letter out. So, in this case, I went in and added work done on file. I did subtype grievance acknowledgement letter sent. This date right here, please populate that date correctly, and because it auto-populates with today's date. So be sure to change that as to when you actually sent this letter. There's going to be several reports that are going to be calculating how long did it take to get an acknowledgement letter out, how long did it take to get a final letter sent out, and that's going to be based on this field here. So be sure to change that. And then down here, we want to make sure that you actually populate it with the letter that you send. So in this case, I populate with, this is the letter, the template that's loaded, the default. But once you type this letter and you have it in a Word document, we need you to copy that content from the Word document and place it in this field. Copy and paste. As well as to attach it, which you can do separately back on the event level screen. You can kind of see it up here in the background. But we need it in both places. And again, that's for the purpose of reporting. So another key change there that I just want to make sure you guys are aware of. So again, copy the actual content of your letter back into this description field. I'll cancel since I've already done that. You'll notice that I included here an investigation. We also are, the level of detail that we need now in our letters, you know, again, referring back to your letter that you're going to be writing, you're going to need all of this detail coming from your managers. And so I believe for those of you on the risk side, you're more familiar with the 6-step review process than I am. But for those of you that are not, it is here. Again, this attachment will be included with the slides that we send out. So if you're not familiar with these, please do. Read over them, get familiar with them, ask your risk manager if you need some additional information. It is the expectation on the complaint and grievance coordinator that you're getting this kind of detail back from your managers and your nursing supervisors, whoever's doing the review on these events. So under investigation, you will probably include the 6-step review process. You might include an SBAR. It just needs to be much more detailed than what you're probably used to seeing at this point. Another thing that you all asked for that we were able to add in when we made some of these changes was an additional location review. I'll just quickly show you that. You just go to your subtype, choose the additional location review, and then it's going to pop up with with the locations here. So in this case, where there was some question about whether the patient was ready to be discharged or not, you might want to involve care transition. You could do that all in one step here instead of having to task that out or to go in and enter it as a separate issue or anything like that. So it's just an option in the review process. And then, of course, the last thing you need to do is your final letter. And there'd be many others. I suspect this list will be getting longer and longer now that this review process is more thorough. But of course, we want to make sure we get that final letter in there. Again, we're going to use the templates that are already built in. and you would, again, if you put that into Word, you'd want to go back and copy and paste that into the description field, and then come in an attachment. You'll notice here that I've attached already both of those letters by simply clicking Add and just browsing to the file location where that was, and I just put in for the description. I put an acknowledgement letter and final letter. Very simple there. Once you get the review process done, then you're ready to close it out. This process hasn't changed all that much. I've already closed out 2 of these issues here, but I'll go ahead and do this one now, just so you can see the steps involved. Basically, the only thing you're needing to do now is to come down here to the issue status and to mark it as resolved. And this will be after the event. And you'll notice here now you have the resolution date. Be sure to put the correct date. We'll just assume it's a couple of days out from now. And then we are also able to add, was this substantiated or not? And some of you had asked for that too. So you have the option of substantiated, unsubstantiated, inconclusive, or not applicable. If you choose that, then you have a place here where you can enter some notes regarding that process. I believe that too is related to magnet and even some things on the risk side. So hopefully that is helpful for you all. So basically, once you close out all the issues, of course you want to check and make sure there's not any task or anything like that. If any of those were created, make sure those are finalized. And then you'd want to basically close out your file. You put in your resolution date here. This is for the event resolution date. The others were for your issue resolution dates. And then down here in your outcomes notes, I've had a lot of questions about what to put here. In my mind, I would summarize it by saying this is whatever you want to put that you would take to your grievance committee. If you want this in a report that you take to a grievance committee and you want to just summarize all the steps that you took, you could put that here. I had another individual say she copies and pastes her final letter right here because that has all the information in it too. If you want to do that, that's fine. Just think of this as a section that really summarizes the work that you did on this file, the outcome of it, and maybe any issues you ran into or anything like that. So once you do that, this resolution summary, it's a required field. You can come in and put anything that you need to here. I believe I have all the fields done, so I can choose save and exit here, or I can come here to more actions and choose close if I know that I'm done. And I would okay, yes, and we do that there. I want to, just as a reminder, kind of going back to the beginning, also remind you to change the owner of the event to yourself as opposed to the submitter. You can do that simply by clicking on the file and change owner. I think most of you are familiar with that process. And just want to reiterate again, if it's a complaint or you think it's a complaint, but it turns out to be a grievance by definition, be sure to go back and change that classification manually to grievance. And then lastly, just a reminder to attach the final letter as well as to copy and paste that final letter into the description field. So at this point, I believe I have covered all that I want to cover. I guess this is where we'll go ahead and open up to questions.